Hi folks, so this is just a very brief introduction to the basic ideas that are going to inform the course and its goals. What is film theory and what's classical versus contemporary film theory? Those two terms that I use to split the course into two distinct halves. So first, let's just talk about the idea of what film theory is. I think a useful way to talk about what film theory is to present it as distinct from these two other vocations of film studies. One of them being film criticism or analysis, the other being film history. Now, immediately I want to say that it's not quite that difficult to distinguish film theory on the one hand from film history on the other. One way to distinguish film history from film theory is to say that film history involves the cataloging of events in the past as shaping that thing that we call film. It's concerned with how things change over time, and those things can be the medium of film, say the material substrate that makes up film, or it can be things like the historical events that largely shape history in general, also will inform film history in particular. That's quite a bit different from theory, which we'll see in a little bit. What's the difference between theory and analysis? I think that's a harder thing to say. For those of you who have taken Cinema 121, one of the main goals of that class was to do film criticism or analysis, often to the exclusion of doing film theory. So what is film theory if it's not film analysis, which is the, say, criticism or analysis of individual films, and it's not film history, which is understanding the thing that we call film as being informed or influenced by the changes that happen in the historical world over time. Well, one way we can think about what film theory does, or what it involves, has to do with this idea of the general or generality. I'm taking three quotes from three different film scholars who are trying to tackle this question of what film theory is. The first is Dudley Andrew, who says, film theorists make and verify propositions about film or some aspect of film. The second is David Bordwell, an author of a very, very popular film studies textbook, a co-author of a film studies textbook called Film Art, who writes, theories are general hypotheses about how best to explain a definite phenomenon. And Robert Stamm writes, film theory refers to any generalized reflection on the patterns and regularities to be found in relation to film as a medium, to film language, to the cinematic apparatus, or to the nature of the cinematic text, or to cinematic reception. What do these things have in common? Well, in each case, they hit on the idea that film theory involves some kinds of claims, or you might use the philosophical jargony term propositions, about this thing that we call film. And when you say that you're involving claims or propositions about film, what you mean are general claims or generalized reflections about film as a medium. Notice the consistent use of generality. Now, usually we think of the general or generalizing as something not to do in the humanities. But in many ways, that thing that we call theory, whether it's film theory or gender and sexuality theory or post-colonial theory, it does involve some kind of generalizing vocation applied to particular phenomena in the world. In this case, with film theory, the phenomenon is an artistic medium that we agree to call film. So if film theory involves general ways of thinking about the medium of film, why is it that film theory looks so wildly different across the 20th century? Well, one thing I want to say is that there's a canonical and influential way of splitting up film theory into two, sometimes three different historical units. For this class, we're going to break it up into two units. The first is classical film theory, which is roughly looking at the years 1915 to 1960, that's always going to be a loose estimation. The second is contemporary film theory, which generally looks at theory from the 1960s on. Now, these two terms seem to be defined purely historically, but often it is observed that the historical determination of classical versus contemporary film theory is not the only way to distinguish them. There are different kinds of concerns that come up with those historical periods. So in the early era of film theory, the classical film theory era, these are the kinds of questions that concern film theorists. The first is something like, what is cinema and what does it do? What makes cinema distinct from the other arts? What makes cinema a legitimate art form? Now you can see those very questions reflected in the books that would come out that were collections of classical film theory. The ambition to call simply the book or the essay on the thing the photoplay, or a big question like what is cinema, or Rudolf Arnheim's film as art, you'll notice the ambitious and broad claims to understanding what this medium is and what it does, right? That is a consistent kind of interest of classical film theory. You'll also get questions that seem to make sense with a new medium, right? What makes cinema distinct from the other arts? Well, that's not so much a question that the contemporary film theorists are looking at, partly because cinema in the first half of the 20th century is a newer medium, right? In fact, there is an early stage of film in which its very uniqueness as a medium is posed as a question. Is film a unique medium? Is it even a medium that has the capacity to create art, given that it seems bound to the reality of the world? In other words, it's easy to make a beautiful image with the photographic and cinematographic arts. All you have to do is point it at a beautiful thing and then hit record or push a button. So these questions are very much bound up in classical film theory. Now, what about contemporary film theory? Things get a bit different around 1960. You start to get questions like, how does cinema produce meaning? And indeed, yes, that question was hit on by certain classical film theorists, but you get a more ambitious, more systematic investigation of this question, especially as theories of meaning in general are propagating in the world in the 1960s. People are turning to linguistics and psychoanalysis as ways to understand meaning in general, and they get applied to filmic or cinematic meaning in the 1960s. Second, how does cinema perpetuate the dominant ideology? Notice how different a question this is from these questions, because this has an inherent value judgment based in it, right? It's observed by often left-wing intellectuals that film as a medium is particularly good at hooking the masses and at perpetuating rather conservative or normative forms of stories, right? So the question is, how is cinema as a medium uniquely suited to perpetuating these kinds of normative stories and perhaps maintaining a kind of social or political status quo? That's a huge question and a persistent question of contemporary film theory, one that still very much informs how film theory is done today. Third, how does cinema address different kinds of identities? This is kind of a political or a social question that stemmed from the question of cinema perpetuating dominant ideology. What I mean by identities is largely how we think of identity in the humanities today. Identities like class, race, and gender, and also sexuality, right? How is cinema posed to address particular kinds of normative identities, and what happens when we invent new forms of cinematic storytelling that don't seem posed to those normative kinds of identities? And the normative identity in this question would be something like heterosexual, straight, white, male, able-bodied spectators, right? So Richard Rushton, I think, does a nice job clarifying the distinction. And some of the reasons for the distinction between classical and contemporary film theory. He writes, the film theory that emerged in the 1960s signaled a transition in the field's projects and concerns. No longer was the theorist embarked on a campaign to legitimate the medium, right? The auteur theory had helped lend credibility to the cinema, while the medium itself had yielded several accepted masterworks. Notice what he's saying here, right? The idea that film was an art was no longer something that people would challenge. New forms of questions emerged. Cinema's acceptance as an art form equal to that of the traditional arts here being literature and painting, that kind of thing, and music, had been more or less consolidated now, theorists shifted their sights to analyzing cinema as a system of social and symbolic meaning. What I think is important in this passage are a couple things. First, once again, Rushton is pointing out the fact that given that cinema had changed throughout the 20th century, especially by the second half of the 20th century, no longer was it considered a kind of unique and important question to question the legitimacy of the medium. And second, this idea that we analyze cinema as a system of social and symbolic meaning. That idea of system, the adjective systemic, is incredibly important to understanding what contemporary film theory changed to classical film theory. And that will become really apparent as we shift to the second half of the course. So we can look at these three questions and notice a kind of pattern among them. That classical film theory might be understood as dealing with the what of cinema. What kind of thing is it? What is it as distinct from the other things we might oppose it against, right? The other arts like painting, like literature, or like music. What is it that makes cinema a legitimate art form? Contemporary film theory you might think of as dealing with the how of cinema's influence. How is cinema so influential? How does it perpetuate the dominant ideology? How does it address different kinds of identities? How does it work on us? How does it produce meaning for us? A second kind of distinction that you might draw from classical film theory and contemporary film theory is that classical film theory is very much bound up with a love and enthusiasm for movies, for cinema, right? What motivates this writing is often an excitement for the medium and its possibilities. And the idea that certain kinds of, say, gatekeepers of artistic value are saying that cinema is not a valid art form is just fuel for the fire of classical film theorists who are so enthusiastic about this new medium and its capabilities that it spurs them to write pages and pages of theoretical claims about what the uniqueness of this medium is. On the other hand, right, we have contemporary film theory, which for the most part is not really motivated by a love of cinema. It's motivated by a suspicion of cinema, right? So of course I have to kind of qualify that and say it's a suspicion of dominant Hollywood cinema and a enthusiasm for the kind of cinema that might be posed against the dominant, right? So that's incredibly important that cinema starts to get bracketed into different forms. Okay, so I think that is a pretty good distinction, or a helpful distinction between the two different sectors of the class, classical film theory versus contemporary film theory. But now I want to provide a brief kind of introduction to the film theory that we're going to be looking at in the first half of the class, classical film theory. And I want to do that as a way, or one way I want to do that is to think about how classical film theory, the idea of theorizing what this new medium is something that's happening even before the formal texts of film theory that we're reading, say the Munsterberg of week 2, or the Arnheim of week 4. I want to think that classical film theory happens before what we think of as classical film theory. What do I mean by that? Think about the ways in which, at the very beginning of this new medium, just the very names for the companies or the devices of early cinema reveal an attitude, a theoretical attitude about what is the uniqueness of that medium, right? So if one of the vocations of classical film theory is to ask the question, what is cinema and what does it do? Look at the names for, say, companies, Vitagraph and Biograph. Biograph, of course, being D.W. Griffith's film company. Certain devices. Thomas Edison had the Vitascope, his first projection device. Edison's kinetoscope, seen here, also preceded the Vitascope. The term that the Lumiere brothers used was the cinematograph, which we still have in English today with the same word without the E on the end. And of course, today's term cinema is itself a word that means something according to its etymology. So if you look at the etymological derivations of these terms, they all actually articulate some kind of theoretical proposition about what is unique about the movies. So you could in fact kind of do a bit of theory to say, what does it mean that certain names insist on the importance of writing movement? Or what does it mean that life is invoked all the time? That one takes a little bit more thought to imagine. What is it about the moving image that suggests the presence of life? All right, so we can think of these things as theoretical with respect to the specificity of the medium. They're doing classical film theory just by kind of intuiting useful names for this thing. Another version of kind of classical film theory happening as an encounter with the novelty of the medium of cinema can be found in this little 2-page report, Maxim Gorky's The Lumiere Cinematograph, sometimes called The Kingdom of Shadows. Maxim Gorky was a Russian poet, and he wrote a brief kind of report or a review of the Lumiere brothers' exhibition of their films in early 1896. Of course, the year attached to the first projection of the Lumiere films is December of 1895. But if you look at the writing, the way in which he articulates his encounter is very much articulating a hypothesis to these questions. What is cinema? What does it do? What makes cinema distinct from the other arts? So I just wanted to remind us of the kind of experience that Maxim Gorky in 1896 had when he viewed Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat. So let's just consider, right, that experience of a Lumiere short, and then look at a paragraph from Maxim Gorky's Lumiere Cinematograph, and imagine what theoretical propositions about the medium is he articulating simply by virtue of his fairly poetic description of the medium. He starts by saying, "Last night, I was in the kingdom of shadows. If you only knew how strange it is to be there. It is a world without sound, without color. Everything there, the earth, the trees, the people, the water, and the air, is dipped in monotonous gray. Gray rays of the sun across the gray sky, gray eyes and gray faces, and the leaves of the trees are ashen gray. It is not life, but its shadow. It is not motion, but its soundless specter." Now, of course, what we would call this paragraph is not, say, formal film theory. It is a kind of poetically inflected description of an encounter with a new medium, but in its richness of its description, it's already articulating theoretical propositions about the medium. Here's one thing that I think is interesting to note about what he's doing. He says, "It's a world without sound, without color. Everything there is dipped in monotonous gray." Now, what might be interesting about this description? Well, what's fascinating, I think, about it is that the grayness or the black and whiteness of the cinematographic image is not itself that new. After all, Gorky was very much familiar with the lifelike black and white or grayscale image of photography. And yet, what strikes Gorky about the image is the idea that he's looking at a gray world. So what might we say about this? So what's interesting is that instead of saying, "Last night I looked at a photograph come to life," he doesn't actually think of the moving image as a thing he already knows, that is a photograph, with an added property of movement or life. Instead, the first thing he says is, "I saw a world," that is something akin to his perception of natural reality in front of him, that is without something, that is without sound, without color. So what Gorky is kind of articulating is that there's two ways of, say, understanding or experiencing the novelty of the cinematographic image. In one sense, you can think of it as an image you already know with something added, movement, or the lifelike or realism of the moving image is so powerful that he takes a different route. He says, it's almost like looking at a world, the way I look at the world in front of me, with things sapped from it, right? With no sound, without color. Those two ways of experiencing the novelty of the moving image will tell you something about what it is uniquely as an image. The image is so real for Gorky that it's closer to a world than it is to a photograph. And we can actually look at other aspects of his writing as articulating medium-specific conditions of cinema, right? At one point he says, all this moves, teems with life, and upon approaching the edge of the screen, vanishes somewhere beyond it. So what Gorky is actually articulating is there's something so real about the moving image, so say perceptually verisimilitudinous, we might be very precise in our language, that he notices it's strange when human figures, or maybe vehicles, approach the edge of the screen and disappear, which is not exactly how we experience moving objects and people reach the edge of our perception. There isn't a hard kind of linear boundary that distinguishes what we can see from what we can't. There's more of a kind of a gradient of clarity, right? Things slowly disappear from our perception as opposed to reaching a hard edge and suddenly disappear, right? Gorky is trying to articulate what makes the cinematic image almost like a real world in front of him. Or you can think about the way Gorky articulates his experience of the train film, right? He says, everything vanishes and a train appears on the screen. It speeds straight at you, watch out. It seems as though it will plunge into the darkness in which you sit. But this too is but a train of shadows. Now I think this is really important to read in light of the famous myth, which is that spectators were so naive about the status of the image as being an image that they mistook the train momentarily for a real train, and then they say got up and fainted, or they ducked, or they screamed in horror because the position of the camera was such that it was almost as if it was coming straight at them, either that it was going to leap through the screen or that the screen wasn't actually there and was kind of a window into a world in which a dangerous object was about to penetrate their own space of the cafe. What's interesting is that Gorky articulates this naive viewer's perspective, but he also says something to mitigate that. He says, it seems as though it will plunge into the darkness in which you sit. This too is but a train of shadows. So what we're getting is not naivete, but a desire to articulate a paradox, right? That the image is both so lifelike that it is as if it is real, and yet the knowledge that it is a mere image is always informing the experience of the image. Some scholars will call this a kind of uncanniness, right? The idea that I know something is dead and yet it feels alive, right? That is one way we might articulate the unwitting film theory, or classical film theory, of Maxim Gorky. And one final little bit from Gorky's article is he says, I saw Lumiere's cinematograph moving photography. The extraordinary impression it creates is so unique and complex that I doubt my ability to describe it with all its nuances. Here, I want to say that Gorky is also articulating something theoretical, or a kind of theoretical proposition about the uniqueness of the image. Because what if we imagine that we've never seen a cinematographic image before? If our goal is to describe an image like this one, say The Baby's Breakfast by the Lumiere brothers, think about just how much is occurring, right? How many levels of description there are. First, if we imagine description as a kind of Netflix synopsis, we might say this is a fairly simple film of two parents and their baby, and they're feeding their baby kind of a lunch of a cracker, right? But then we'll notice that if we want to get more detailed, we start to notice all of the objects that are on the table. We notice the way in which the mother figure reaches for the tea. We'll notice the way in which the father figure, who's played by one of the Lumiere brothers himself, gives the biscuit to the child. We might notice striking moments, like at this particular moment, the baby almost reaches out to what might be the camera person, gesturing beyond the world of the film and revealing the artifice of its construction. This too could be subject to description of the content of the film. And famously, there's one kind of final detail that might be subject to description of this film that is historically significant. That is, spectators were famously fixated not on the little drama that's put right before the camera, but they were fixated on what's in the background, the movement of the leaves in the trees, right? The idea being that one aspect of the novelty of the moving image is that it captures things that couldn't possibly be planned by an artistic intention, right? That no matter how much of a fiction you stage before the camera, one unique aspect of a cinematographic image is that you'll always get little contingencies, things you don't plan. The fact that at every moment the leaves in the trees move in this particular way. That too could be subject to a description, a nuance that is bound up within this text that we call Baby's Breakfast, a 1-minute film by the Lumiere brothers, right? So in doing this little exercise, I merely want to show you the kinds of claims that can emerge from an encounter with a moving image that might resonate with the kind of claims that you'll see within the first 6 and 7 weeks of this course, right? What makes a moving image distinct from the other media that we compare it with? Painting, or the novel, or theater. What is the nature of the realism of the cinematographic image? These kinds of questions are bound up with the novelty of the moving image in something like Maxim Gorky's Encounter.